Hello, welcome to this week's edition of the Stock Report. I'm Tim Bontemps, NBA reporter for ESPN, here to tell you what I found interesting around the NBA over the past week. And let's start with Anthony Davis, who has been on an absolute tear for the Los Angeles Lakers. Over his past 9 games, Davis is leading the league in points scored at 35.3 per game, leading the league in rebounds at 15.6 per game, and is second in the league at blocks at 2.9 per game, only behind Milwaukee Bucks center Brook Lopez. And look, Anthony Davis is playing like a center now. The idea of him being a power forward and being this versatile, all over the court offensive threat, those days are over. Davis is a center. He's playing like a center, and he's been absolutely dominant over the past 3 weeks. And if the Lakers want to have any chance to be a competitive team this season, the kind of team that could get into the playoffs in the Western Conference, Anthony Davis has to be this kind of player, and he has to do this on a nightly basis against all competition. And look, the Lakers won a bunch of games against Detroit and San Antonio, and you said, all right, let's see what they do when they start playing real teams. They had a really nice win on the road against the Bucks on Friday. Anthony Davis had 55 and 17 in Washington on Sunday. They are playing like a team that is starting to make some strides. These wins over the weekend were actual good wins, not these wins against Detroit and San Antonio that didn't matter. And now let's see if Anthony Davis can stay on the court and keep producing like this. Both those things are real question marks. But AD is playing like a center, and the Lakers are really benefiting as a result from what's been easily the best stretch of his and the Lakers season. Now let's look at the Denver Nuggets, who sit in third place in the Western Conference. They are 2 games behind the Phoenix Suns for first place in the West. And here's why I think right now, as of today, Denver is going to have the best record in the Western Conference at the end of the season. Denver has played 8 home games and 15 road games through the first 23 games of the season. Now, anybody who follows the NBA knows that Denver wins a ton of games at home every single season because the absolute monster advantage they have at altitude, playing in the Mile High City in Denver. With them only being on an 8-15 split, it's tied for Houston with the lowest amount of home games played so far this season. I expect Denver to rack up a ton of wins moving forward at home. They're going to have Jamal Murray improve as the season goes along. Michael Porter Jr. is settling in nicely after coming off another back issue last year, robbed him basically the entire season. And Nikola Jokic still looks like one of the best players on the planet. So I think if you're a Denver fan, you have to be very optimistic about what this team looks like right now. And I think going forward, again, sitting 2 games behind Phoenix with a huge deficit in their home to road split, where Phoenix is the other way around. I think you got to look at this thing right now and say Denver is, to me, the best bet to have the best record in the West at the end of this regular season. With how bunched up things are and how wide open the West is, that could be the difference between getting to the NBA Finals, which would be the first time that's ever happened for Denver, or losing in the first or second round potentially if you get the wrong matchup. Like, seeding is going to be critically important, I think, in the West, and I think Denver's in position to really take advantage of that. And finally, got to talk about the Sacramento Kings. Very happy for Kings fans. The Light the Beam movement has been very fun to watch. Kings had a nice win again over Chicago on Sunday, overcame 41 points from Zach LaVine to beat the Bulls. And this has been a fun story. The Kings have not had very much to celebrate or be excited about for well over a decade. I was very vocal last year. I did not like the Tyrese Halliburton trade. I still don't like the Tyrese Halliburton trade. But De'Aaron Fox is playing really well. Domantas Sabonis is playing well. The Kings have a fun up-and-down style. Kevin Huerter's bombing away from three-point range, shooting great. Atlanta Hawks could certainly use his shooting ability with the way they struggle to shoot threes this year. But it's mostly just a fun story for a great fan base in Sacramento that has been starved for success for a very long time. And I'm glad they're getting to see it. It's been a very fun start. If the Kings can stay in the top 6 and make the playoffs, or even get out of the play-in and make the playoffs, that would be seen as a huge win in Sacramento, which has not made the playoffs in nearly 20 years. And it would be nice to see this franchise get into the playoffs and give these fans, which have lived through a lot of ugly basketball in Sacramento and a lot of miserable times, something to really celebrate and enjoy. So from this standpoint, it's been cool to see the Kings play the way they have been, and I hope that they continue to push forward, like I said, just to give some long-suffering Kings fans something really fun to watch over the next few months. Now let's shift to the stock down portion of the program. We're going to start here in New York with RJ Barrett, who has really struggled since signing an extension to stay with the Knicks this summer. The Knicks finally got a win at home, snapping a 5-game losing streak, beating Donovan Mitchell and the Cleveland Cavaliers on Sunday. Donovan's just shooting 40% on the, or Donovan. RJ Barrett's shooting just 40% on the year, though. He's shooting 28.2% from three. In Sunday's game, for example, scores 15 points, is +7, but he goes 5 for 13 from the field. And, RJ has developed into a solid two-way wing player. That's a very valuable piece in today's NBA. Everybody's trying to find quality two-way wing play, but he's got to become a better and more consistent offensive threat than he has been through this first quarter or so of the season. And he showed signs the last, at different points through the first 3 years of his career of taking a real significant step forward at that end of the court. I thought Jalen Brunson's arrival would get him some cleaner looks, some better shots. I thought he'd become more efficient. So far, that has not been the case. Now, RJ has traditionally been a pretty slow starter, and then he's come on a lot in December and January and through the rest of the season. Certainly, there's time for him to do that. But for a Knicks team that has been up and down, that has lost a bunch of close games lately to teams that are, pretty clearly on paper, I think, better than them, they need RJ to get back to the level he was playing at the second half of last year if they want to look at this as being a situation where they can get enough wins to really firmly ensconce themselves in a play-in spot and potentially get back into the playoffs again this spring. Another team that's in that similar boat in the middle to bottom tier of the Eastern Conference is the Chicago Bulls. I mentioned that they lost to the Kings earlier. They're now 9-14 on the season. And if you go through Chicago's schedule here in the month of December, there are not a lot of wins on the docket for the Bulls going forward. I mean, you're talking about, they play Detroit and Houston later on this month. Those are the only two games they play against teams with worse records than them. They've got Washington, Dallas, Atlanta, a couple huge games next week with the Knicks. Then they play Minnesota. That's a stretch of games that could be pretty important for them. Play Miami and Atlanta again. They get Milwaukee later. They have a home with Cleveland. Going into January, they play Brooklyn, Philly, Utah, Boston. It's a long stretch of competitive opponents for the Chicago Bulls, and they need to start getting some wins. And you're talking about even after beating the Celtics and Bucks, recently, you're talking about a team that went 2-4 on this recent West Coast swing, is now 9-14 on the season, is starting to lose ground and lose touch with these teams fighting for those 7 to 10 spots in the East. And if this next couple of weeks goes south and they struggle to get wins, you could be talking about a pretty sizable gap in the Eastern Conference standings between the Bulls and those teams in the play-in mix. And that is certainly not what a Chicago team that, Arturas Karnisovas has said this team is supposed to push forward and win a playoff series as the next step forward after making the playoffs last year. That is not, not making the play-in tournament or struggling to make the play-in tournament. That is not what this Bulls team was anticipating after, re-signing Zach LaVine to a 5-year max, bringing this team back from last year. They thought they were going to push forward. And obviously, Lonzo Ball's injury has been a huge problem for the Bulls, but certainly this team has got to start getting things into gear, and it's going to be difficult here over these next few weeks to do that. And if they don't, they could find their season ended pretty early and having some real questions to answer about what they should do in January heading into the February trade deadline. And then finally, we got to talk about the San Antonio Spurs, who, frankly, have turned losing into an art form over the past several weeks. I know people aren't really paying attention to the San Antonio Spurs, and I get that. I mean, they're clearly one of the worst teams in the league. They play in a small market. There's not a lot of reason to be zeroed in on them on a nightly basis if you're, a casual NBA fan. But the Spurs right now already have the NBA's worst net rating. They had the league's worst defense. They had the league's second worst offense, right? That's over the course of the entire NBA season. Obviously, that's a sign of being a pretty terrible basketball team, right? They have a net rating of negative 11.6 per 100 possessions. It means you're being outscored by 11.6 points per 100 possessions. That is easily the most in the NBA by more than 3.5 points. Let me just read to you, though, what the Spurs record is, or what the Spurs stats are over the last 11 games when they have lost all of them and have plummeted to the bottom of the NBA standings. They have an offensive rating of 103.1. That is 2.9 points worse than the Charlotte Hornets in 29th. They have a defensive rating of 122.5. That is 2.5 points worse than the Orlando Magic in 29th. They have a net rating of negative 19.4. To put that into context, the Spurs have been outscored by 19.4 points per 100 possessions. That's essentially being outscored. There's, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 possessions in an NBA game. Sometimes, probably these days, it's a little more than that. Means you're roughly getting outscored by 20 points a game. And to put a finer point on this, over those 11 games since November 14th, the San Antonio Spurs have been outscored by a grand total. Just get this, a grand total of 214 points. That is very nearly 20 points per game, 19.5 points per game that this team has been outscored by. That is ridiculous. It is very, very difficult to do that. Again, to put this in context, the Orlando Magic, who are 1-10 over that stretch, by the way, as the Victor Wembanyama sweepstakes are well underway, Orlando's been outscored by 132 points over that stretch. No other team in the NBA has been outscored by more than 61. So the Spurs are basically triple lapping the field in terms of how truly terrible they have been in recent weeks. And, look, San Antonio, clearly they have moved into a rebuilding phase, finally, and fully have committed to it. But, man, they certainly have committed to it because they are doing everything they can to be at the bottom of the standings, to give themselves the best shot at getting Victor Wembanyama. They got David Robinson, 1989. Then they got Tim Duncan. That led to one of the great runs we've ever seen in the NBA in terms of long-term consistent success. And the Spurs are certainly putting themselves in position to get their hands on Victor Wembanyama and potentially, if he lives up to the already incredibly lofty expectations on him, to have potentially to be in a situation where they can have another run like that again. But if there were Spurs fans who, after the brief hot start San Antonio had, worried about this team being a little too good this year, last few weeks have put an end to any thought about that being the case, because they have been truly among the worst possible teams you could be in the NBA over the past month. But that will do it for this week's edition of the Stock Report. Thank you, as always, for following along. We'll be back next week, see what happens in the NBA over the next 7 days. But until then, enjoy the great basketball. We'll talk to y'all soon.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.